The Arleigh Burke class of guided missile destroyers, the backbone of the US Navy, could have been designed to be a lot more capable, but that didn't happen because of a dilemma. The dilemma of capability versus cost. The truth is, American shipyards can build better ships, but Congress doesn't want to pay for them, which is why some key design elements of the Arleigh Burke destroyers were more influenced by budgetary watchdogs than naval engineers. Luckily for this class, the political pressures to keep down the costs arguably turned Arleigh Burke into the most successful and most produced destroyer since World War II. But why, with all that success, the latest iteration of the class, the Flight III, is the end of the road for the Burke class is not what you think. To understand how Arleigh Burke destroyers came to be, first we need to talk about the highs and the lows. The high-low mix philosophy was pioneered by Admiral Elmo Zumwalt Jr., the person that the budget-breaking DDG-1000 destroyer is named after. The purpose of the high-low mix was to save taxpayers' money. The idea was that no country, be it the Soviet Union or the United States, can afford to build large numbers of expensive ships for prolonged periods of time. The issue with an all-high navy was that it would be so expensive that there would not be enough ships to control the sea. The issue with an all-low navy was that even though enough ships could be procured, they would not have the capability to meet certain kinds of threats or perform particular types of missions. In order to have both ships that are powerful and ships that are good enough, there had to be a mix of high and low. During peacetime, low-end warships would be forward deployed to manage gunboat diplomacy. But during wartime, they would be held back to protect convoys and ports, while large, powerful ships were deployed into the most dangerous waters. Zumwalt served as the chief of naval operations between 1970 and 1974, and he oversaw the procurement of many new naval ships. For example, a few expensive Virginia-class nuclear-powered guided missile cruisers were the high mix, each costing about $300 million at a time, and they were supplemented by a larger, low-mix fleet of relatively affordable Perry-class frigates with a price tag of $50 million per ship at the time. Similarly, Ticonderoga cruisers were the high-mix platform for getting the Aegis Combat System into the fleet. But the Navy also needed a low-cost surface combatant, which yielded the Arleigh Burke destroyers. But it was the political considerations, not technical requirements, that dictated these destroyers to be smaller and less capable compared to Ticonderoga cruisers. These new destroyers were to be at least 50 feet shorter with a maximum displacement of 8,300 tons, have one gun instead of two, smaller missile capacity, and no helicopter hangars. But even with these limitations, the expectations were quite high. The new low-mix destroyer class had to be able to operate independently in rough seas for long periods of time and with substantial speed. After all, the class was named after Admiral Arleigh Albert Burke, who aside from his achievements, had a pretty cool nickname. During World War II, Burke mistakenly led his destroyer squadron into a Japanese minefield. Admiral Hazley radioed him.
"What are you doing in a Japanese minefield?"
31 knots, he replied. And 31-knot Burke stuck. But in order for new Arleigh Burke-class destroyers to achieve speeds in excess of 30 knots and have desirable seakeeping characteristics, the designers needed the new hull to be longer than the politicians had allowed for. Imagine your design requirement reads 50 feet shorter than Ticonderoga. But the designers worked around that limitation. They upgraded the gas turbines from the originally planned 80,000 shaft horsepower to 100,000 and designed a new waterplane area hull with a wide bow. These changes compensated for the hull length that the designers couldn't get and resulted in a unique shape that was nicknamed Arleigh Brick. While some compromises had to be made due to artificial political limitations imposed, in certain areas no compromises were made. For example, the Arleigh Brick was designed with a steel superstructure, unlike the aluminum superstructure on the Ticonderoga. After all, some lessons had been learned from the devastating fire on USS Belknap, which melted the aluminum superstructure, and also from the Royal Navy's experience during the Falklands War. But first, you know those video games that have a fancy commercial, but then the actual game looks like this? Well, that's not the case with our video sponsor, War Thunder, because this game is amazing to play, and it's free. I've been recently playing more naval battles on War Thunder, and I gotta say, there's nothing more satisfying than launching a successful torpedo attack, because the physics of the game are pretty realistic, so you have to account for your speed and direction as well as your enemy's heading. In War Thunder, you can choose from a variety of historically accurate vehicles, not just ships, but tanks and airplanes too, and play in arcade battles and tactical wars. If, like me, you don't have a fancy gaming computer either, you can still enjoy playing War Thunder on a regular PC, Xbox, or PlayStation. The game is in fact fully cross-platform. On top of all that, there are free bonuses like a premium tank, aircraft, or ship, and a 7-day premium account. Just register using the link in the description and claim your exclusive bonus. At the time that the US Navy was designing the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the Perry-class frigates and the Spruance-class destroyers were acknowledged to be inadequate for handling the type of threats projected for the 1990s and the 21st century, like anti-ship cruise missiles that would fly lower, faster, and with less radar cross-section than their predecessors. The Arleigh Burke-class was to be multi-mission, that is, to be flexible and capable against an array of threats. Such ships should be able to deploy forward for independent operations in the face of a variety of threats, including anti-ship cruise missiles launched from the air, surface, and shore, theater ballistic missiles, mines, small craft, torpedoes, and various types of chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. The surface combatant should also be able to contribute to offensive power projection. Various combat systems were examined to be installed on the Burke-class, including the upgraded Perry-class combat system. But these systems failed to meet the new minimum performance requirements in virtually every warfare area. This is why the Aegis Combat System was so revolutionary. There are three major advances that differentiates the Aegis from the combat systems installed on the previous Perry-class frigates and Spruance-class destroyers: the Spy-1 phased array radar, the vertical launch system, and the integrated combat system. The Spy-1 phased array radar is the most crucial part of the Aegis combat system. First introduced on the Ticonderoga cruisers, the Spy-1 revolutionized the traditional detect and engage sequence. A traditional rotating radar, like the ones used on Perry-class frigates, can update the location of incoming missiles only as fast as the radar can rotate, an update rate of about once every 4 seconds. Compare that to the phased array Spy-1 radars, which can provide real-time 360-degree coverage, enabling them to establish fire control quality track on incoming missiles up to 4 times faster than a rotating radar. At best, in the early 90s, the detection of a low-flying anti-ship missile, such as Exocet or SSN-22, would occur at or near the radar horizon, which is about 12 miles from the ship. With the earliest initial detection and alert operators, Perry-class frigates and Spruance-class destroyers will only get one engagement opportunity before the missile closes to inside the minimum engagement range. Now, this doesn't leave much room for errors, does it? In contrast, the Aegis destroyers will have several engagement opportunities against incoming anti-ship missiles due to the fast conversion of the initial radar detection to the fire control quality track. On top of all this, Aegis destroyers are equipped with an automated detect-to-engage sequence, which further reduces the manual firing sequence response time. But Aegis destroyers not only can track better, they can also respond more quickly. The next revolutionary part of the Aegis combat system is the Vertical Launch System, or VLS. VLS was first put into service by the Soviet Union in 1980 on the Kirov nuclear-powered guided missile cruiser. 6 years later, Americans had their own version of the VLS, the Mark 41, which replaced above-the-deck launchers on USS Bunker Hill, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. Older above-the-deck missile launchers such as Mark 13 and Mark 26 were limited to a rate of fire no faster than the complex magazine-to-launcher reload process. The Mark 13 launcher could fire 1 missile every 9 seconds, and Mark 26 could fire 2 missiles every 9 seconds. Another limitation was that above-the-deck launchers were limited to firing standard missiles and anti-submarine rockets only. In contrast, the Mark 41 VLS allows for a firing rate of about 1 missile per second, because the VLS modules act as the magazine and the launcher. Additionally, a large variety of missile types is supported. Theoretically, a Flight IIA Arleigh Burke-class destroyer can launch 12 missiles at the same time, as that's how many 8-cell modules the destroyer has. Each 8-cell module has a single exhaust system, meaning that after a single missile is fired, there must be downtime to cool off. Otherwise, the next missile might get cooked inside if launched too early. That said, Arleigh Burke destroyers cannot launch 12 missiles at the same time due to other limitations, including the maximum number of missiles that it can direct simultaneously during startup. Finally, at the heart of Aegis is the Aegis weapon system, which integrates onboard radars with other sensors like the ones on satellites, combines weapons such as VLS and CWIS, and unifies the communications and human interface into a highly automated system. The integration of information from various systems in real time results in an increased reaction time for decision makers. And as you already know, reaction time matters a lot. The Arleigh Burke class has been constructed in flights to accommodate technological advances. In 1988, the construction of Flight I, the most basic Arleigh Burke destroyer, began with a total of 21 produced. Starting in 1995, 7 slightly larger Flight II iterations were produced. Again, up to this point, the Burke-class debate was more focused on the ship's cost rather than its military capabilities. That did, however, change in 1997, when construction of 34 Flight IIA destroyers began. Flight IIA destroyers were 4 feet longer and 1,000 tons heavier than the previous flights. 6 more Mark 41 VLS cells were added, while 2 Harpoon anti-ship missile launchers were removed. But the biggest addition was the dual helicopter hangars to accommodate 2 SH-60Bs. Helicopters contribute immensely to the ship's surveillance and identification ability, and also provide an over-the-horizon detect and engage anti-surface and anti-submarine capability. Even between flights, the class continued to evolve. Starting with USS Mustin, the funnels were buried within the superstructure to decrease the ship's radar cross-section. USS Michael Murphy, DDG-112, was supposed to be the last Arleigh Burke destroyer produced, with her construction beginning in 2010. But a few years later, it became apparent that the Zumwalt class and littoral combat ships were not going to pan out. Only 3 Zumwalt destroyers had been built out of the 32 planned. So in 2013, the US Navy was forced to resume the production of Arleigh Burke Flight IIA. But shortly after, the Flight IIA was deemed outdated, so the US Navy started working on the Flight III design. While the design work was underway, the under-construction Flight IIA destroyers were designated as technology insertion ships with elements of the future Flight III. The Flight III iteration was not a new idea. It was actually first considered in the early 1990s, but the idea was shelved when attention turned to the future Zumwalt-class destroyers. The Flight III, in a way, was a no-brainer. After the fiscal failure of the high-mix Zumwalt class, the Flight III was a low-risk idea. Flight III is nearly bow-to-stern redesigned and has a displacement of 9,700 tons. This iteration brings a new electronic warfare system, Aegis Baseline 10 combat system, and an electric plant into the Arleigh Burke hull. The Flight III will also feature the new Spy 6 radar, which can detect an object half the size at a distance 4 times longer compared to previous Spy 1 radar. According to the manufacturer, it will be roughly 30 times more sensitive and will be able to track 30 times the number of targets compared to the existing Spy 1 radar. The downside, the Spy 6 will consume twice as much power. USS Jack H. Lucas will be the first Flight III destroyer. Her construction began in 2019 with an expected commission date in 2023. Currently, 2 shipyards are building 2 Flight III destroyers per year. Up to 42 Flight III Arleigh Burke destroyers may be procured. But here's the thing, the Burkes have been in production for nearly 40 years. The hull was designed in the 1980s, and it's totally maxed out with 30 years of upgrades. Yes, the Flight III will be the most capable destroyer built to date, but it represents a bridge from the past to the future. That's because Flight III is the beginning of the end for the Arleigh Burke class. You could say the ship is SOL because of the SLA. Service Life Allowance, or SLA, is extra capacity, excess space, power, and cooling to facilitate new equipment in the future. For example, the Spruance class had a significant amount of excess space, which resulted in the addition of Tomahawk cruise missiles at a later date. This flexibility eventually allowed the construction of Ticonderoga-class cruisers on the Spruance hull. The SLA is quite important, considering that surface combatants are expected to have a service life of about 40 years, allowing the entire class to have a lifespan of 75 years or so. But it's almost impossible to predict what technologies would emerge in the future and what kind of footprints they will exactly require. This is why warships are designed with extra space to house these future technologies. The amount of excess space ranges from 5% on smaller warships to 10% or more for larger warships. Similarly, brand new ships in the class must come with extra power capacity. New technologies like railguns and direct energy weapons require huge amounts of electrical power that many of today's warships simply cannot generate. For example, the Nimitz-class carriers were designed in the 1960s, and as new technologies were added on, the power generation capacity of these supercarriers was maxed out. With lessons learned from Nimitz carriers, the all-new Ford-class supercarriers were designed in a way that ensures enough electricity generation capacity for unforeseen technological advancements. And this is why only about half of Ford's power generation capacity is allocated to run current systems, with the other half reserved for future technologies. The latest Flight III Arleigh Burke destroyer is at the end of the road because the service life allowance on this platform has been fully consumed, meaning that all the space, weight, and power has already been allocated. There is simply no more room on the hull for new capabilities. For example, the US Navy had to make a compromise on the size of the new Spy-6 radar. They wanted at least a 20-foot version of the new radar, because that's the size needed to accommodate future warfare requirements. But even with an enlarged deck house, the Flight III could only accommodate a 14-foot version of the radar. The previous flights had to fit an even smaller Spy-6 radar, with only 24 radar module assemblies versus 37 on the Flight III. The artificial political limitations imprinted into the original Arleigh Burke design may have resulted in the class being maxed out today. But in hindsight, maybe those limitations weren't a bad thing. They led to an evolutionary process which produced a successful class of destroyers while saving some money, compared to the revolutionary budgetary nightmare that the Zumwalt destroyers experienced. With that said, you can't make the Burke class any larger. The only solution to add new technologies is to develop a new hull. And that's precisely why the US Navy is currently developing the next generation guided missile destroyers DDG-X. It does seem like the US Navy is setting up the DDG-X program for success by taking an evolutionary approach as opposed to revolutionary, just like they did with the Burke class, by adding new technologies with each new flight iteration. The first DDG-X destroyer would be bare bone, one might say, but the US Navy has learned an expensive lesson from the failed DDG-1000 program when they incorporated way too many new things at once. In contrast to Zumwalt, the new DDG-X surface combatant will come with a new hull, the combat system from the Arleigh Burke Flight III, a 32-cell Mark 41 VLS, 2 ram launchers, and the integrated electric propulsion. Future versions show possibilities for swappable VLS systems, hypersonic missiles, and direct energy weapons. DDG-X is expected to operate alongside the Arleigh Burke class destroyers starting in the 2030s. Meanwhile, Flight III is expected to be in service into the 2060s. But, and it's a big but, and I cannot lie, since all the space and service allowance have already been allocated, if new threats like hypersonic missiles become imminent, It could mean that Flight III will end up like Spruance-class destroyers and the littoral combat ships, retiring much sooner than anticipated. Play War Thunder. This free vehicle combat game works on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. Click the link in the description to take advantage of War Thunder's exclusive bonuses for Not What You Think viewers and join over 50 million War Thunder players around the world.